The House of Mystery presents Inside Writing, the radio show where authors discuss their writing process in all genres.
Welcome back to the House of Mystery, and of course I'm Al Warren. Now today we have, I guess we would call him a fantasy writer. So let's find out what it's all about. Mr. Alex Shvartsman, thank you for being here.
Thanks very much for having me.
Alex, this is really fascinating to me because there are so many genres out there, and I see you're put under paranormal urban fantasy, literature fiction. So it's kind of I always try to separate everything and figure it out. This is maybe because I'm getting too old, because I classify it all as science fiction, which I know isn't right. So how do you classify your writing?
I classify it as speculative fiction because I feel like that covers everything, right? You got, whether I'm writing about spaceships, robots, angels, wizards, dragons, it all counts as speculative. So I really like that term. Now, I really wouldn't classify myself as somebody who's writing like that subcategory. I think that's just probably the Amazon robots running amok and doing their own thing. What I'm writing currently is best classified as humorous urban fantasy.
Okay. So you have a lot of humor. And I know your main character, like in the newest book here you've got coming out, it's called The Middling Affliction, and it's the Conradverse Chronicles Book 1.
That's right.
So the humor you put in it is that derived from you and kind of your own sort of look at the world, maybe?
In a large way, yes. For me, I never imagined myself being somebody who writes humor. Never pictured it when I was young, and I kind of daydreamt about writing science fiction and getting a book published someday. I always imagined myself tackling these serious issues and like writing, grown-up stuff that's that's all taken without any grain of salt whatsoever. And then one day, as I started actually working to break into to this writing industry, shall we say. One day I felt particularly contrarian, and I just started writing a funny story. And they say that it's much more difficult to write humor, which is probably true for most people. I found it liberating. I found that I was just having fun with it. I was coming up with stuff off the cuff. The story flowed. The energy of it was just much more, much more interesting and fun for me to do. So I think I kind of found my calling, which is not to say that I don't write more serious science fiction and other speculative stuff as well. But humor really holds a special place in my heart. And I tend to, I can't do stand-up comedy because I'm not just that quick on my feet. But if you give me time to actually think it through and do a couple of revisions, I can come up with some fairly funny stuff. And so a lot of authors struggle with that. So I kind of take that as my advantage, and I certainly press it by writing both humorous novels and humorous short stories.
Well, there's probably a certain amount of honesty that comes out in the humor, right? I mean, when you're kind of like when you got a character that's maybe sarcastic or a little bit humorous in that way, it's really kind of a way of being honest, don't you think?
Absolutely. There's a saying that I'm very fond of, and it goes something like, in every joke, there's a little bit of a joke, because the rest of it is true.
Yeah. But do you find you have to be a little bit careful on, let's say, the timing of such humor? You
always take a risk when you're writing a humorous story. And it's not so much that that I think I'm going to offend somebody, or, because I'm not writing sort of the stuff that's going to poke the bear and get people, get into like really controversial topics or anything like that. The danger that you're really facing is that the joke is not going to land. And if the joke falls flat, then the entire story might collapse for the reader. So the trick to that, in my opinion, is to try and write the story in a way that if every single joke fails, if the person just doesn't find you funny at all, there's still enough plot and enough character development and enough momentum to carry the story forward as something that's, light, but not necessarily humorous in the eyes of that particular reader. And if you can find that balancing act, that tightrope, then you can consistently come up with stuff that's going to be eminently readable because you're not completely relying just on the jokes.
Now, I noticed the location is New York City, and when I see that, supernatural, and you're kind of getting into the speculative part of things. So in a way, you write New York City how you want it to be in your book, and isn't that kind of you're writing it like a character in a way?
I absolutely do write it as a character, though I will argue against the fact that I write it the way I want it to be, because boy, do I, usually, good authors torture their characters, and New York City is definitely a character in my books. So it gets into some really tough times through, and I'm not going to spoil specific details, but all sorts of unpleasant things happen to the city and its citizens, and it's up to the characters to prevent such things. So I don't know that I'm going to go as far as to say that that I write New York the way that I want to see it. It's more that I write New York as someone who has lived here for the past 30 years and really loves the city and kind of wants to present the story from the point of view of a character who likewise really loves their city and is willing to go to great lengths and even risk their life to protect it.
Now, I noticed in the title, like the whole title is interesting from an outsider looking in, and also how you say Conradverse. So one of your characters is Conrad Brent. So I'm taking it that it's really, the world around Conrad. Maybe explain the title and what Conradverse is.
Sure. So Conrad Brent is he works for an organization called The Watch, which is a volunteer organization in New York City, and it protects regular people from monsters and magical threats. So he is sort of an arcane cop, though he always hates that description and kind of bristles against it. And the story is told in first person, so you really get into his voice, which is very snarky and sarcastic and humorous in a way that I like to write humor, with lots of pop culture references and just sort of, he always has a running commentary going on everything that's around him. Now, while he holds this very important post as somebody who's the main guardian of Brooklyn against the supernatural, he has a dark secret as well. He doesn't actually have magic. He's something called a middling. He can perceive magic and he can use magical artifacts, but he can't generate magic on his own. So in the story, he describes himself as Batman because he is this guy who has no superpowers and is forced to rely on gadgets in a world filled with superheroes and supervillains. Now, being a middling, the reason why I say that's a dark secret is middlings in the society are despised and hated by most people, even some of the other good guys. And Conrad is very carefully guarding his secret because he doesn't want anyone to find out. Things will turn really, really unpleasant for him if they do. There are many societies and religions and cults within this magical version of New York and the world, the Conradverse, as I call it, who are instructed to kill middlings on sight. So it would be really dangerous for him if this information got out. And so what he has to deal with is he has to continue to do his job and essentially be better at dealing with magical threats than anybody with actual magic. So there's an added level of layer of challenge for him.
So in the magical city of New York and the magical threats and monsters you talk about, are they standard fare? And I don't mean that as a negative, but I mean when you create and have monsters and different magical attacks happening in this Conradverse, is it traditional? Is it stuff that other people are aware of from other books and movies and things like that, or do you create your own sort of magical beings?
Most of the characters that I deal with are traditional magical beings that you would be familiar with from other tropes, but I always take great care to put my own spin on them. So I really like subverting the tropes. So I do have vampires, but they don't act or behave the way that vampires do in most, in most fantasy stories. I do have trolls and other magical creatures, and they all have their own sort of motivations and feelings and things, and they're not your typical Dungeons and Dragons fare. Now, what makes the world of the Conradverse a little bit different is the way that I set it up. The explanation that Conrad gives is that in the society, about 1 in every 30,000 people is born with a gene that allows them to perceive and cast magic. Everybody else is completely unaware of its existence. So we're talking about more secret history level stuff, kind of like the movie Highlander, where they're aware of each other and some other people are aware of them, but the society at large isn't. So Conrad is one of those people who is aware of what's actually going on, but an average person, their brain kind of edits the reality for them. So if a troll walks by you and you yourself don't have that gene, you're going to perceive that troll as maybe like a really large biker or something. So your brain will kind of see somebody throwing a fireball and you'll think that they're using a flamethrower. So an average person, unless they are specifically read in on the supernatural and on all the secret stuff that goes on in the city, they simply go on about their lives and they don't know any better.
Wow. So your characters that you've got in here, how do you experience them? Are you seeing them, visually, or do you hear their voices, or what's your experience in characters?
I see a movie in my head. And so the scenes, I don't know that I necessarily describe every scene in a very cinematic way, but the way that it starts out in my brain and from that goes onto the page, I definitely see a movie playing. And that's why I think the dialogue is a little bit more sort of like snappy TV show dialogue rather than, rather than something else. Actually, a couple of people have described it as comic book dialogue, which is not bad. I'm not actually a big comic book reader, but I certainly will accept that as an appropriate description of what's going on. But it's always like fast moving and snappy, and that's sort of what I'm shooting for. And I kind of hear in my head their banter, and like how they would talk to each other and what everything looks like.
So when things are happening in the story, and you're creating this book in this new magical world, do you have an underlying theme or perhaps a subtext or something that you're trying to get across as a point? Is there something more than the entertainment value?
Absolutely. There's always a third rail. That's what I refer to such things that are it's underneath, under the scenes. I don't beat you over the head with it, but there is that underlying serious theme to the story. And in this particular story, the theme is institutionalized prejudice. So Conrad is dealing with this his entire life, where he's not at fault for being born the way that he was. And he doesn't understand how that happened. He doesn't know what it means, why middlings even exists. He's never met another one because they're so rare. So he exists in this vacuum, and he has to deal with a society where, as I said, even the good guys may necessarily turn on him on a dime if they find out what he is. And he's not the only character in the story that's dealing in one way or another with institutionalized prejudice. There are other characters who have their own arcs that are dealing with that in their own ways. And again, I'm not lecturing and I'm not beating the reader over the head with it. This is something that's in the background, but it is certainly felt. And there are similar themes like that for the sequels. The Conradverse was always imagined to be a trilogy. So I have a plan for the first 3 books. Beyond that, we shall see how popular it is and how well it does. But there is a story that I'm telling through the 3 books. And the second book is about the role of government and how no organization or power should have too much power, no matter how well-meaning they happen to be and why. So there's that, so, and the third book, I don't want to even really get into yet because that's still in the construction stage. The second book is largely written. So, so I can talk about it a little bit.
So do you kind of outline each of the books? Like you've got, you said a trilogy, so you're looking at 3 books so far. And when you picture that in your mind, when you have it set, is there a basic outline, or do you have it really structured well and then you fill in the details, or is it just kind of an idea and you run with it?
There is the slimmest and the most flimsy of outlines. And the reason I say this is I know what the major story arc is. I know what the story begins with. I know what and who the villain is. That sort of like is the overarching villain of the 3 books, even though each book is structured to be so that you could read it as an individual story. So you're not kind of stuck with you're not stuck with, hey, here's half a book, wait a year, and I'll give you the other half. I hate when authors do that to me, and I don't want to be the author that does it to my readers. So each of them is a standalone story, but there is an overarching plot. So think of it as a TV show where you have every episode kind of deals with a problem. The main characters have a problem they need to resolve, but there's also this slow-moving greater plot that kind of advances from the beginning to the end.
Yeah, I think it's good that they stand alone, but it's important to get each book of the story read, because there's going to be development or things that happen to characters that you're not going to know about if you don't.
Right, and so I kind of walked away a little bit from your original question. So what I end up doing is I know where for every book, and in fact for every short story that I write, before I sit down and I type the first sentence, I have to know how the story begins, what the problem is that the characters are going to be dealing with, and I have to know how it ends. A lot of the stuff in the middle, I kind of come up with as I'm writing. So a lot of the cooler world building stuff and better jokes are things that just occurred to me as I was writing that particular scene, that particular chapter. But I do have a guiding light where I know that every chapter that I write, every scene that I write needs to in some way progress the overall story toward the ending that I've envisioned. And I have that for each individual book, and I have that for the trilogy as well. So I know what the resolution is going to be, and I kind of need to make sure that while I'm telling individual stories in each book, those stories do not mess with what I've envisioned for the ending in a way that's going to break it.
Now, a lot of fiction writers that we speak to on the show will describe their characters in a sense of like a position. Like they'll say, it's like my kids, it's like friends, it's like family. And they say that a lot of times their characters sometimes go off the rails and do things that you don't want them to do, or they don't want to listen to your story. And I hear all these different descriptions. Do you relate to that, or do you have the same sort of things happening with you and your characters?
Oh, absolutely. So for one, this entire thing started out as a couple of short stories. And my plan was to write more short stories in this universe, but the main character being a pushy grifter that he is, has conned me into turning it into a trilogy. Likewise, there's a character who starts out as a minor villain in book 1, but she's so fun to write that she just becomes a major character throughout the series. And I didn't intend it that way. She just was meant to be there for like a couple of chapters. And then she just sort of talked her way back into the story, and she appears throughout much of book 1, and she becomes an even more important character in book 2. So I definitely have that happen to me, where the characters just kind of take, they take the stage and they're like, I'm the important one.
How do you deal with something like that? Like, when characters are, let's say, fighting you on what you are trying to do in a story, how does that work out then?
Well, I usually let them win, because if I've established enough depth to the character, where the character kind of wants to do their own thing, and everything that I know about the character is telling me that, hey, they need to go in this direction, even though I initially meant to do something different. I tend to go with that because you want internal consistency. You want the story to feel, you want the way that the characters act and what they're doing to feel natural to that character and not just feel like it's the author with a bunch of marionettes that he's moving around the stage. So, and this is where it makes my life easier that I only outline the bare bone basics of the major plot points that I need to hit, because usually these changes, these unanticipated changes, they may move the story in a slightly different direction, but there is enough stretch to it where it doesn't completely mess with my overall plan.
Now, I noticed in your bio, you've written quite a few short stories, like 120 or something, it says. Do you sort of like the idea of short stories better than a full book?
Well, there's a couple of things that go into that. I do really enjoy reading short stories. I grew up, and my first exposure to science fiction wasn't actually novels. It was short story collections, and it was mostly American and British short stories that I read in translation that were originally written in like the 1950s to 1970s. So I read a lot of like Shackley and Asimov and Frederick Brown, which is going back a little bit further, and sort of like that era of short stories are always these relatively short things, but you have clever characters coming out with unexpected solutions to a difficult problem. And so that's where I kind of learned how to structure a science fiction story. Now, fast forward many years and half a world away, because I grew up in the former Soviet Union, and for a very long time I didn't even attempt writing because I didn't think that my English would ever be good enough to be published professionally. So when I finally decided that I'm going to give it a shot, and I started writing, I was like, well, hey, wait a minute. How do I know if what I'm writing is any good at all? Because you're not a bad, none of us are the best judge of our own writing. And so I came up with this quote unquote brilliant plan. Since I didn't know any other writers, I didn't have any critique partners, I didn't have anybody in my support network that could really help me. So I decided, hey, let me write a few short stories, send them out to magazines. And once those stories get to the point where they start selling, that's when I know that my writing is good enough and I can actually go and write a novel. So I started writing and sending out short stories, and eventually one sold, and then another sold, and another, and it became like popcorn. It's really difficult to stop. I became addicted to tracking these submissions in a spreadsheet and checking my email all the time to see if I got it. And every time you get an acceptance letter, that's like this really nice, boost, to your ego. And so I kept writing short stories, and never, it took me a fairly long time before I even started working on my first novel. So I built up, it's more than 120 by now, but I just stopped keeping track very, very carefully of it because there were so many, not counting reprints and podcasts and, and translations and everything else. So now I still write an occasional short story here and there. But I definitely have made a conscious effort to move into novels, which is not, I wouldn't say it's more difficult, but it's more rewarding. Most people most of the writers who are well recognized tend to be novelists, even if they do write excellent short stories. Not that many people outside of like hardcore hobbyists have read George R. R. Martin's short stories necessarily, but they all know Game of Thrones and the subsequent books. And so it's much more rewarding if you happen to do well to write novels. And ultimately, both are very enjoyable, but boy, is it a lot more work to do a novel, because that could take months, if not years.
Yeah. Yeah. And in the novels, you tend to flesh out the characters a whole lot more, like people learn more about them.
They do, and you have to take a completely different, drastic approach to novels. I mean, my prose, because I did short stories for so long, my prose tends to be really terse and really laconic, because you need that. Like if you're trying to squeeze an entire story into like 4,000 words, you have to find shortcuts. You have to find a way to make a fewer number of words perform the same job where the other person would write that many paragraphs. And so now that I've been doing novels for a few years, I'm starting to kind of relax a little bit and allow myself to become slightly more verbose, which is definitely noticeable when I have to go back and write a short story for an anthology or something. I have to then remember that, hey, I'm writing a short story. I don't have all that space to spare. So I need to go back to that really, really tight prose of, without giving myself an opportunity to come up with some fun asides or really over describe something. So it's definitely a different skill set.
Oh yeah, no, for sure. Now, of course, a lot of authors put a lot of themselves, like their own feelings and lives, and they say that you are part of a lot of the characters and a lot of the story. What do you think in your personal life comes out in your stories?
Well, there's a lot. I don't think an author can separate themselves from their characters, but it's also very dangerous to assume that anything that comes out of the character's mouth is a philosophy that the author subscribes to, because you have to have a lot of characters with conflicting views. That tension is where the narrative momentum comes from. And so you have to be willing and able to adopt, these views that may be opposite to your own, and be able to have the characters argue where it's not a straw man argument, where both sides feel like they're like they truly believe what they're saying, right? And so and so you have to kind of learn to be a lot more adept at being able to argue the other side. It kind of actually makes me think of a debate team. So if you go in high school or junior high, if you go to a debate team, that's a skill that they teach you. And I had to pick that up on my own because, I don't agree with everything that my characters are saying, but every one of them certainly has some of my DNA. And any author that tells you otherwise is not necessarily lying, but they're probably not quite understanding themselves as well as they should.
Yeah, that's true. Now, so I noticed that you've written for like UFO publishing, and you sort of have a lot of paranormal sort of aspects. Is this come from personal experience? Do you have sort of a belief, or do you follow the paranormal side or UFO side that goes on?
Not even a little bit. So first of all, UFO publishing is my own imprint, and it was created to publish a series of anthologies called Unidentified Finding Objects. So the word UFO in that sense has nothing to do with the actual UFO sightings or people who believe that they've seen an alien or hunting ghosts or anything like that. Now, because of the name of the imprint for UFO publishing, I do get a lot of emails and a lot of manuscript submissions along those lines, which I promptly delete. I don't subscribe to any of that at all. I do believe there's intelligent life out there in the universe. I think it's very hard to be a science fiction writer and discount that possibility. But I don't think that there are little green men that are flying around and abducting cattle or whatever video game trope people tend to subscribe to. UFO has to do specifically with unidentified finding objects, which is a series of anthologies that's been around for a little over 10 years. There are 8 volumes in it, and we're actually working on the next volume now. UFO 9 is going to come out by the end of this year. And I've had everyone from Neil Gaiman to Esther Friesner to Ellen Jean Foster to Esther Friesner appear in his books.
Yeah, it's a pretty interesting area. A lot of people sure believe or really get into it, Yeah. And now you also do a lot of translation, I've noticed, and maybe tell the listeners a little bit about your translation work.
So, as I mentioned earlier, I grew up in the Soviet Union. I was born in Ukraine, and my native language is Russian. So I speak. So English is actually my third language. When I came over here, it took me a long time to get to the point where I still speak with an accent. I'm sure you can hear it, and so can your listeners. But I picked up enough vocabulary, enough skills to be able to actually write in English. But I still continue to read in multiple languages. And there's a lot of really great science fiction that's been written in Russian that has never been translated. Only a very small tip of the iceberg has become available in English or in other languages. And the very first short story that I translated was on a whim. I really, my entire motivation was to geek out about a really cool story with my English-speaking friends that wouldn't have otherwise been able to read it. So when I did that, I found that it's a complementary but a very different skill to writing. And you do need your own writing chops in order to make the final version of the translation flow and read nicely for when you're translating fiction. But it's actually a lot more akin to doing a jigsaw puzzle or Sudoku. You kind of zone out and you are solving this really difficult puzzle because you're looking at a statement in one language and you have to be conscious of its subtext, and you have to kind of really think about, well, how do I relay that to a reader in a different language with a completely different set of backgrounds and experiences? So, for example, if somebody writes, and then he ran down the road like a roadrunner, what does that really mean to a person in a different culture that's never seen Roadrunner cartoons, right? You can't translate that directly. That will be completely meaningless to them and somewhat misleading. So you have to figure out a way how to phrase that in the target language where while you are betraying the exact text of the story, you are presenting the reader with the same idea. And that's where the real fun part comes from, is that you're translating the ideas rather than translating the text word by word. So it becomes a lot more of an art skill rather than a technical skill. So to date, I have translated novels, movie scripts, video game materials, TV shows, and all sorts of short stories. And most relevant to the fans of speculative fictions would be the short story work, because a lot of that is readily available online. So there's magazines that have the materials posted, and you don't have to buy anything. You can just go and read them. You can check out on my own website. There is a bibliography page, and it has a whole bunch of links to the translated stories. So if you're curious about reading works written in Russian, and that doesn't just mean that there are works from Russia. There are works from Ukraine, Russia, Belarus, and all the republics where Russian was the main language. At least for a while. Though things are changing now. So those works are readily available. And there's a lot of, like I said, when I started this tirade, I said that there's a lot of really, really great works out there that haven't been translated. And I'm doing a tiny, tiny bit to fix that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a pretty amazing amount of work, because you're right. There's a lot of detail that you can miss with simple translation, just translating the words. I know I did some project from the 1920s in Germany, and all the papers, everything was in German. So I needed help with not only the translation, but the explanation of what some of the meaning behind the sayings were.
Absolutely. And that's part of the good translation, is to investigate those things and to be well enough immersed in the language that you can understand where the author is coming from and what they're trying to say. A lot of the translations that I've encountered, they're performed by people who learned the language, who didn't grow up immersed in it. They tend to make some very reasonable mistakes. And by the way, I'm not free of this sin either. I've caught my own mistakes in translations down the line because it was dealing with something highly specialized, or it was dealing with something that is out of date, and I didn't recognize it. So these all translations are not infallible, but as a translator, your job is to just try and come up with the best possible version of the text in the target language that'll make it easy for the reader to comprehend it and not to stumble over the stilted language that is often associated with translation, because the people involved are sometimes, they're very, very good translators in terms of the knowledge of the source language, but they're not themselves writers. And that makes it so much more difficult for them to come up with a final text that is refined and that feels natural to the reader.
What is your writing process? Like, how do you sit down and get into writing a book? And I mean this in a sense, do you have to have a certain surrounding? Do you have to have certain things around you, a certain place? And do you have to be in a certain mood? Or can you actually just time out and say, well, there's no one around from 10 to 2 today, so I'm going to sit down and write? And can you actually do it?
So yeah, being in the right mood helps, but anybody who is writing at any professional level has to find a way around that, because you're not always going to be in the right mood. You're not always going to be in the right place. So you need to kind of learn the skill of just getting in front of the keyboard and putting in the work. One of the ways that I solve that problem is to have multiple projects going at the same time. So if I'm in a really sour mood and I'm not up for writing light, funny, fluffy fiction, then maybe I have a dark story that I'm working on at the same time, like a short story. Or maybe I have a blog post that I need to write, or an interview, or maybe I can translate a couple of pages. So I'm definitely able to get to sit down in front of the keyboard and start working, but it may not necessarily be just the one project. Having said that, my preference is to hide away from the world. I have a little home office that's a tiny, tiny cubby on top of my garage where I could barely turn around, but it's all mine, and it has 2 doors between it and the rest of the house. So I get a peace and quiet. I'm not playing music while I'm writing. I'm not getting any distractions. Ideally, just peace and quiet. I've tried writing at Starbucks once, and I didn't have a choice. I had like an hour plus to kill, and that was really the only place. So it was either just waste that time or write in Starbucks. And I don't know how people do it, honestly. Like, it's the same thing on an airplane. I can't write on an airplane because I have this weird fixation that the person sitting next to me is going to read over my shoulder. And while I'm ludicrously happy for people to read my stuff, I want it to be finished and polished first.
Yeah. Well, yeah, you might be sitting beside a killer too, right?
Yeah, but like after they read my stuff, they'd be too scared to kill me.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, is there a particular one book that if no one had heard, if someone comes along, they've never heard of you before, and they say, well, what book would kind of give me an idea of what kind of writer you are, which would you select?
So of the stuff that's already out, which predates this upcoming book that's going to be out in just a few days, I would say it's my first short story collection. It's called Explaining Cthulhu to Grandma and Other Stories. And it collects most of my early short story work, including the 2 short stories that inspired the Conradverse, as well as the title story, which is an award-winning story that's been translated into a whole bunch of languages and reprinted many, many times over, which is probably my most successful and best-known work. I think that the reason I say it's that particular book and not my first novel or my novella is because there's so much range in there. There's stories that are humorous. There's stories that are very dark. There's stories that have that, like the Shackley-esque, clever character solving a problem angle. And they're all there in one book, and I'm very proud of that work. And the sort of, you can see as you read it, you can see what shaped me as an author. Now, having said that, as I do realize that most people prefer novels to short stories. It's just a fact of life. Novels are more successful, more people read them. So if you are going to pick up a novel of mine, I have to say the middling Affliction is the way to go, because it's really my voice. I mean, it's that snarky, funny, sarcastic, first-person narration that I've been writing the Conrad voice for so long now, I can just slide into it. I can talk like Conrad, other than the accent, of course. So that's probably the most representative of the current work that I'm doing.
So when you hear Conrad's voice, does he tell you to do weird things?
No, he tells me to write more stuff about him, but I wouldn't say that's weird. I think that's just self-preservation.
Yeah. Yeah, but you don't wake up in any location that you don't know how you got there or anything like
And
that.
if I did know, I would not tell you on national radio.
Well, we've got to get a little bit something out of you, some sort of surprise. So where do you see yourself going next after this book is out? This book is out on the 31st of May, I believe. So what happens after the book is done?
Well, I'm almost done writing the sequel, and then it's going to be on to book 3. I really want to make sure that the trilogy is complete, and even if it's going to probably be published a year apart, so you're not going to get the entire trilogy until 2024, because that's just how traditional publishing works. I'm perfectly okay with just having it, in my drawer, be done, so that I can get the entire thing on paper, and then I'll feel much more comfortable moving on to the next project. And I do have a lot of other ideas that range from Shakespearean space opera to dark post-apocalyptic urban fantasy. So there's all sorts of different things. They're not all going to be humorous. I tend to really enjoy exploring things that I haven't already done before. So once I get the voice down, once I get the stories out, the whole Conradverse series written, I am going to want to try something else, even if ultimately I come back to writing more humor, because that's been my forte for a long time now. But being able to go out and try these things, and maybe some of them are just going to be novellas and not novels, just so I can kind of do a palate cleanser in between books. That's the next frontier. That's definitely it's going to keep me busy for just the ideas that I have written down, and the plots, the general sort of like the general outlines, the sketches that I have out right now could keep me busy in writing for the next decade.
How long does it take you to complete one of these novels, like in this series?
I am an incredibly slow writer. My first novel took me about 4 years to complete. The first Conradverse novel took me about 2 years, and the second one took about a year. So I am getting better at it. I'm getting a little faster, but certainly not at the pace of the writers that I like and admire, who are able to just dedicate the time to writing a book, and 3 months later they have a book that's probably better than anything I've written. So I'm not there yet. I hope that one day I'll come up from a baby writer and join their ranks where I can do that. But for now, I'm pretty slow. I would say that it's a bulk of a year for me to write a book that's not even necessarily very thick. But I do, in the meantime, also, while working a day job, I will also translate a whole bunch of stuff and write some short stories and, edit anthologies and, do all sorts of other creative work. I like to explain it as me collecting different hats and wearing all these different hats as editor and publisher and writer and translator. And so I never get tired of trying on new hats. So even as my writing may be somewhat slow, my creative output is not.
How do you know when the book is ready? Because in my experience with writing and other writers, I would say that you can always go back to it and kind of go, well, I like to do this, or I need to change this, or, every time you look back at something you've done, you want to change it. So when do you say enough's enough?
I don't remember who said it, but there is a quote that says the novels are never finished, they just escape. And I definitely subscribe to that theory. If I didn't sell the book, if I didn't have a publisher that was just ready to put it out already, I'd probably keep going back and just massaging it and changing a word here and a sentence there and throwing in an extra joke. And that process would never be over. So I'm very thankful for deadlines. Deadlines is what gets me to produce stuff, because at the end of the day, if there's very little time left, I'll be crying while I'm banging on the keyboard, but stuff will get done. And ultimately, at some point, it gives me the legitimate excuse that I need to let go of the book.
Do you ever look back at some of your older work and kind of want to change something?
A little bit, but not too badly. I've actually had the opportunity to do that, because when you have a bunch of short stories and you're putting them together into a collection, you can actually make some changes. There's nothing out there that says, hey, it was published this way and therefore it must stay this way forevermore. You can actually make some small, and I'm not going to misrepresent it to my readers and go, hey, this is the story A, and then completely rewrite it to become story B. But I can certainly, if I see something that I could do better today than I could when I wrote the story 10 years ago, I can definitely massage that language a little bit. I find, though, that usually it's very minor technical stuff. I'm quite happy with the plotting and the pacing that I've done from the beginning. Like I'm actually not embarrassed of my early work at all. It's just a minor sort of like you acquire better writing tools in your tool belt. And so I could probably just write slightly more polished and smoothly today than I could when I started out. But at the same time, as I said, when you asked me the question about what represents my work best, it's a collection of stories that include stuff that was written at the beginning of my career.
How do you like the new world with social media and the way people can have almost immediate access to you, whether they're positive readers that like you or fans or ones that maybe dislike what you do? Do you find that you interact a lot with people, or do you stay away from it?
I interact with people a little too much. I definitely admit to wasting way too much time on Facebook. And I have to say, my experiences have been largely very positive because I don't tend to get into arguments with people. I tend to, share joy over their successes, and like their published work and, the milestones in their lives. And I tend to share, funny memes and observations and things like that. And so my social media experience has been, by and large, more positive than average, I would say. I think we all make our own experiences. If you come to Twitter or any other social media platform and you're ready to brawl and you're out there to engage people who disagree with you, you will find that fight, and you'll find it very, very quickly. I don't tend to seek them out. I mean, I have my opinions, but I tend to get along with people, and often get along with people that dislike each other because of whatever arguments that they're having at the time. So I just like to keep it that way. I've had very few negative interactions online for now, and who knows how that'll change. I'm sure somebody somewhere will find issue with my work and call me names and everything, but I'll just move on. There's plenty of good people that I can enjoy socializing with other than that person.
Well, you just turn them into a character and make them suffer.
Never. Being turned into a character is an honor, and it is reserved for my friends and not my enemies. Even if those characters die horribly.
Yeah, that's interesting. Wow. So how do people get a hold of you? Do you have a website, and what social media do you like them to find you on?
So my website is shvartsman.com. It's just straight up, just like my name. And you can find me on either Twitter or Facebook. All my Facebook posts are generally public, so people can follow me on there. Not all of them are about writing, but I tend to just share fun stuff through there. And I'm a little bit less active on Twitter, but you can find me on Twitter as A. Shvartsman. So again, first letter of my first name followed by my last name, and I always post anything that's relevant. So if a new short story comes out, I'll put it up on my blog, I'll put it up on Twitter, I'll put it up on Facebook, but that's the extent of my social media. I haven't joined TikTok or Instagram or YouTube. I just can't. I know that if I start using all those platforms, I'll enjoy it, just like I'm enjoying the ones I'm using now, and then there will be no time to do anything productive.
Yeah, you'll be on TikTok dancing around with books, and we'll put all that up on our website as well. People can find you with one click, and that'll be easy for them. How did COVID affect your writing in the sense of stress and anxiety, and does that kind of, like, when weird things are going on outside of the world around you and there's a lot of tension, do you think that gets into your writing somehow, or does it shut you down on writing?
It allowed me more free time to write. And I know it sounds terrible, and I would much rather be busy and have COVID not happen, obviously. But on a personal level, it increased my productivity, if anything, because I was stuck at home. I picked up a lot more translation work because it's a work that I was able to do from home without interacting with other human beings. And I needed to pay the bills. I was able to write more of my own stuff. And yes, the anxiety and the stress may have prevented me from writing humor for a little bit, but I was able to, once things just started settling into a routine, and not that so much that it got a lot better, but I became a little bit more used and a little bit kind of more build a harder shell around myself, I would say. Once I was able to kind of interact with what's going on, especially being in New York, my zip code at one point had the highest percentage of cases in the world, at least from the places that reported their numbers. So it was really challenging for a while, but ultimately, I think it resulted in more words being written.
Yeah, I had all sorts of reactions. I had a lot of writers say they were shut down, they were unable to write because they were, stressed or just didn't have the creativity during a lot of the stress, and others that were like yourself, able to just do it no problem. They liked being alone in that. And do you ever come across a writer's block for yourself, or a time where you just can't write?
Absolutely. And I'm in a very privileged position of not having to rely on my writing for income. So at the end of the day, if I don't feel like writing, I don't have to write. But I also, as I said earlier, I think it's important that if you're writing at a professional level, you need to find ways of working around writer's block. And very early on, I found out that usually writer's block means that your brain is not quite ready to move forward with a specific project because it's mulling something over in the background. There's a background process, just like in your computer, that's just sort of taking up all of your memory and you can't do it. So my solution to that is just to have several things that I'm working on at one level or another. And when I encounter that, that roadblock, I just sit down and I work on something else.
Wow. Interesting conversation. And I'm glad you came along. Now, the book we're talking about that's just coming out is The Middling Affliction, and it's the Conradverse Chronicles Book 1. Our guest is the author of that, Alex Shvartsman. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
Tired of wasting time trying to decide what to watch on your streaming service? Go to our website and look for the Martino movie reviews.
You've been listening to the House of Mystery radio show. To find out more about our guests, hosts, or shows, go to www.houseofmystery.com.
Show's over for now.
Was it as good for you as it was for me?
Well, good night.
This has been a production of Something Weird Media.
I'll be back.
You've been listening to the House of Mystery radio show. To find out more about our guests, hosts, or shows, go to www.houseofmystery.com.
Show's over for now.
Was it as good for you as it was for me?
Well, good night.
This has been a production of Something Weird Media.
I'll be back.